editor, we've got the different inputs on the left hand side of the way I can use the editor to my advantage, using R2 to grow selection and shrink it down, which will come in handy when it comes to adjusting the landscape of the level, essentially. I believe if I use L1 for the toolbox, yes, so this is essentially allows me to add assets into the world, characters, changing the landscape or terrain, weapons, weather, and other aspects of this. So firstly, we'll look into some of the objects the game has to offer. So as for game modes, it looks like we have alarms, objective markers, permanent objective markers, and spawn points, which will help with the core function. For gameplay, we have a bunch of different weapons that the player can take advantage of, ammo types, vehicles, climbing and navigation, so ladders. So this will be good. Health, items, explosive scripting, trigger. Ooh, okay, so here we have trigger scripts that we can use to create certain trigger events in the world, which may come in handy for potential mission-based mechanics into the outpost, giving potentially multiple objectives to the player, which can come in handy. Then we have some Far Cry 5 architecture objects. So there's a series of different assets for interior, exterior stuff, which will come in handy. I'm considering making the level approachable in different ways. So if there's a player that wants to take the outpost stealthily, there should be that opportunity for him to take it stealthily. Then I'll probably do another way where the player will can just rush straight in, full throttle with potentially like two weapons, with like vehicles that they can experiment with, and so on. I'm not gonna look over every aspect because otherwise this will just take too long. However, just looking at it broadly, we have a lot of different genres as well, so I could theme it quite well. We also have stuff from the older games, which will come to my advantage, allowing it to also give a little bit of a story to the outpost as well, using bodies and maybe some wear and tears in the environment to help illustrate certain events that might have happened within this outpost previously before the player got there, and so on. From the looks of it, we have different sound cues that I can look into. I'm not sure how to actually activate these, but these can come in handy to help the player kind of understand what's going on in terms of affordance. Maybe I could use these as hints. For example, if a sound effect is played in a certain area, that means that they're on the right path, or so, something along those lines, essentially. Then we have some generic shapes that the player can use, just some basic building blocks. These likely I won't be using at all because they're just too basic, and I might as well use the actual assets built into the editor as is. But these are just things to consider. Now, that's for the assets. Now let's see with some of the AI, so the enemies and the different characters. So for enemies, we have different followers that will, I'm assuming, follow the player, I believe, if they catch the player. I'm not too sure what all these do, and it seems like they have different waves, so potentially one wave of enemies, second wave, so on. Enemy security, so these will probably add security to the outpost itself. I'm not too sure as to what each of these mean just yet. This one needs to get looked into. Here is the VIP aspect, which I was talking about before, for maybe a VIP style outpost where I set one, like maybe three VIP targets that the player has to take out to actually complete the outpost. Enemies chosen. Now, as for the chosen enemies, I'm unsure what this technically means. However, these are probably like stealth-based characters, but I know the hunters are like a lot more stealthier. They do a lot of damage with the bow and arrow. As for enemy heralds, I believe that these are like bosses, something similar to VIP targets. So I may use these because they're probably a lot more tankier. Enemy angels, I believe, is to do with one of the story elements. And enemy zombies. Oh, so here are some zombie creatures. This could be an interesting take on an outpost and zombie outpost potentially. That could be a consideration where the player will have to take on a series of different zombies that have incapacitated an outpost and they potentially have to rescue civilians inside an outpost. That may be an interesting Far Cry concept for an outpost level. Now, as for allies, of course, these are just normal ally NPCs. Then we have just some neutral ones, which I probably won't be using. Animals, I could use some animals, maybe uh, some of these blood dragons could act as maybe like a boss in the level, like a larger HP boss style element. After all the zombies are cleared, a zombie blood dragon kind of spawns in that the player will have to take on at the end. It's definitely something to consider. Control zones, I believe, may be to do with the area the animals can and NPCs can patrol around, potentially and navigate. So this is to do with the locomotion of the character, I'm assuming. Animation points, I am probably just want thinking that this is just to do specific animations that are preset for that character, so certain characters will only be able to do certain things. That's my guess. And then spawning references, these are essentially spawn points for these enemies, I guess. But this will be looked into further detail later down the line. As for terrain, very straight to the point, just different tools that I can use to help with creating the terrain of the level. Now, I could use the preset ones like this uh, frosted snow environment or make my own custom one. It seems like we also have paint textures that I can go into as well and actually paint certain textures onto the terrain. And we have vegetation for certain plant environments, which will come in handy. Roads, water elements, and a map limit. So essentially setting a border for the player so they don't go out of bounds. Now, as for loadouts, there's going to be probably some empty ones, I guess, and then using the empty ones, I'll be able to then it'll allow for the player to have some custom loadouts that they can experiment with. As for map details, this will likely be just information about said outpost and stuff so the players can actually find these outposts. So I'm not too fussed about that just yet. Creating a snapshot, very straightforward. Creating a good thumbnail for the level itself so it pops out and is well presented. As for environment and audio, um, if I'm going with that zombie style element, for instance, it might be a darker style level in the night, and I'll use light sources to help guide the player through elements. Potentially, maybe making it more horror style, which means my outpost will have tighter corners, sharper turns to stick to that horror style theme. This is just the concept though. Um, Adding fog, potentially. However, it's a lot to consider when making this level. And then as for sound effects, I could try get like proper themed sounds into this. As for tools, so scripting, like I said before, we have the trigger events and gameplay modifiers. So from the looks of it, these are modifiers that I can just preset into the world for the player. For instance, the no fall damage element, I could have that. However, as I'm flicking through these right now, I likely won't have any of these on. Modified gravity. So what? Right. Maybe highlight NPCs could be an interesting one. Hunter instincts. Uh, Enabling friendly fire for friendly NPCs, just in case. So maybe the player can damage friendly NPCs. Countdown. Game over. But that's essentially me looking over the editor. So there's a lot to consider. Based off what I've seen, there's a few concepts that I've got in mind. Like I said, a high VIP target, just a traditional VIP target that the player will have to get. There's probably going to be three or four of them. They'll be in hard to get spots. This will likely be more a stealth based outpost with stealth based considerations. Concept 2, just a very traditional outpost, different ways of tackling it, very much your typical Far Cry style outpost. Concept 3, the horror zombie style outpost with potentially a blood dragon as a acting boss, uh, which just provides a different concept to your traditional Far Cry outpost. Um, as for maybe a fourth outpost, who knows? I could do something with the water element. Like there's a lot of animals, maybe there's like sharks or stuff in the outpost, and the player will have to use advantages of vehicles and different ways to get to the outpost without having to get in the water and worry about such animals. But these are just things I should consider before I get to that point. Now, as for second devlog of the development process and engine, I think I would be considering starting probably with some of the terrain stuff, working on creating some kind of terrain that will suit the outpost, essentially. Potentially adding a cave system, who knows? I may go with a cave system for one path, and then a head on path, and maybe like a hill path, so there's three ways the player can enter the outpost. Uh, Devlog 3, probably considering getting the bigger assets into the scenes, like a lot of the buildings and stuff, and making sure they're built in a way that just suits that specific outpost style based on what I choose. Um, and then once I get that done, I'll probably start figuring out enemy spawns, how where the enemies will be placed, and then probably worry about pickups in the next one after that. Once pickups are sorted, I'll tweak any scripting based stuff or modifiers. The last thing I'll probably be going into is the different environment and audio settings, as this is probably the least important aspect of the outpost and likely won't take too long, as it's essentially just flicking through a few of these settings to get that done. And then by the end of the devlog, I'll show probably in my last few devlogs a playthrough of the outpost in different ways. So based on my choice, if I have multiple ways of tackling the outpost, I'll show each individual way in a separate video. Thank you for watching this first development log of my Far Cry 5 level, and for the experimentation with the looking into the Unreal Editor, and I will see you in the second devlog.